afternoon, everyone. Green development. Just a decade or so ago, this phrase would have perhaps been an oxymoron. But as the world was recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic, new global challenges emerged. In an increasingly fragmented world, it is crucial that the major global project of achieving the SDGs and battling the climate crisis do not take a back seat. India's theme of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, of one earth, one family, one future, embodies the need to redefine our relationship with nature and ensure cooperative development for all. As the G20 will be helmed by 4 developing economies consecutively, it is an opportune moment to position the forum as the leading global governance mechanism for developing a new sustainable development pact between the global north and the global south. And India is well placed and motivated to create a cooperative agenda which can pave the way for such a pact. India's G20 priorities will be shaped by its own experiences. This is already evident in India putting forward a bold agenda for improving financial flows for sustainable development, for equitable climate action, and is setting the agenda for global sustainable consumption through the principle of lifestyle for environment, the LIFE movement. In this context, this side event on green development comes at the right time, the right moment, to build on India's existing efforts at framing a representative, inclusive, and equitable new sustainable development pact. And I hope everyone here is as excited as I am for the discussions to come. Thank you.
I don't want to make any long comments. Jeffrey has a flight to catch. We want to get around with the discussion. I just want to say that we in India want to be very ambitious. We want to be inclusive. We want to be decisive. And we want to be very, very action-oriented. We strongly feel that green development is critical. Green development and SDG are both 2 sides of the same coin. India's really pushed to be the first country in the world to industrialize without decarbonizing the world. Our ambitions are huge. We've already done 172 gigawatts of renewable. We strongly believe that India is climatically blessed. We have top-class entrepreneurship. We must defossilize the world. Electricity is only 20% of the energy balance. 80% is hard-to-abate sectors. This is refinery, steel, cement, long-distance transport, which we need to really decarbonize, which would require us to use renewable to crack water, produce green hydrogen. The size and scale is important. We need to bring down the price of green hydrogen from $4.5 per kilogram to $1 per kilogram by 2030, and this would mean a lot of global free trade. What we are finding is that developed countries of the world are doing protectionism. IRA is a great act to push decarbonization, but it's highly protectionist in nature. And therefore, if you want to bring size and scale and bring green development, it's very key that we have free trade in the world for green hydrogen. Secondly, I think a lot of these issues will come from both finance track, working groups of Sherpa track, and also from engagement groups, plastics, oceans, financing, energy transition. It's multidisciplinary in character, and therefore we'll work with everybody together to really push for a green development agenda of the world. India is being very, very ambitious in this, but we'll try our best, and we look forward to all your suggestions and ideas. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much. We're all thrilled to be here and grateful to the government of India for its presidency of the G20 and all of the leadership that it is showing. We need big results in a very troubled world, and we can achieve big results if we have a good idea and resolve of how to proceed. Since I'm an economist, I'm going to urge us one basic idea: follow the money. We will not have green development we will not have sustainable development unless there is the financing for green and sustainable development. For rich countries, this is not the major issue, but for at least half the world, it is the major issue. Countries want to do things that they simply cannot finance right now. So development finance at the international scale is fundamental, and in my opinion, it is the fundamental objective that the G20 can deliver in September, a breakthrough on financing. I spend every day around the clock speaking with finance ministers around the world. They cannot do their job of achieving the sustainable development goals and the energy transformation without more finance. So that's the basic message. And I won't go through a belabored point except to say that economic development is fundamentally a process of capital deepening. That means more capital per person for a more productive and sustainable society. And I like to emphasize, keep it simple, but not overly simple. There are many kinds of capital that need investment. And I would start with health and human skills through education as the most fundamental of all. For much of the poor world, till today, hundreds of millions of kids are not in school, are not getting health care, and we're asking these societies to develop. It's impossible unless these kids are in school and getting an education and having proper nutrition as their brains develop. And that's a budget issue. Strangely enough, it's a budget issue. Poor countries cannot afford, even out of their national budgets, to have SDG 4 universal secondary education completion. Of course, other kinds of capital investment include infrastructure, protection of natural capital, business capital. All of these are at stake when we talk about the investment needs. The key to speeding the SDGs and Paris Agreement is increased investment across these areas. Believe me, nothing else is going to work unless the kids are in school. That's an investment. Unless there is electrification, unless there is transport, unless there is digital access. Otherwise, it's just nice ideas. And then comes the question of finance, how to pay for these. And the finance has to come through domestic saving, which can be through the budget or domestic capital markets, but for poor countries with a significant component of net foreign saving, meaning augmenting what can be accumulated by the domestic economy. And again, without belaboring the point, more foreign borrowing effectively directed at keeping kids in school, electrification, digitalization means faster development, significantly faster development. It can be also the difference of a poverty trap that persists for decades or actually making a breakthrough. This is very important, what I want to say in 1 minute. Poor countries cannot afford these objectives on their own. Rich countries typically don't care very much about that basic fact and don't look very hard at it. So I spend a number of years encouraging and working with the IMF to actually look at what poor countries can afford regarding sustainable and green development. I like the IMF. I have dozens of students at the IMF. But they did not know 5 years ago how much it costs to put a kid in school, or how much it costs to build a kilometer of road, or how much it costs to ensure electricity access. pretty core stuff if you are the key advisor to finance ministers, if you are in a coherent global system, which we're not. So I worked with them for a number of years, and they did excellent studies, especially the Fiscal Affairs Department, and they showed, lo and behold, poor countries cannot achieve sustainable development on their own. Full stop. There's a gap of hundreds of billions of dollars. It's not a matter of willpower. It's not a matter of caring. It is a matter of money. You want kids in school, you need a school system. You need a budget for that. When you add up these components, which again, I do day in, day out, a poor country cannot manage this on its own. That's why we built a global financial development system, but we've never taken it seriously in asking at what scale should it operate? What should it be doing? So even on a subset of the goals, health, education, roads, water, sanitation, and power, the IMF estimated a $500 billion gap for its 57 countries eligible for its so-called concessional finance. That's not a bad estimate. I'd say we have about $1 trillion gap minimum for the poor countries, perhaps 1 to 2 trillion. That's not a scary or even big number because the world economy in dollar terms is 100 trillion this year. At PPP terms, $160 trillion. Global saving is $30 trillion. We're talking about a very modest part of global saving to make the breakthrough to sustainable development for at least 4 billion people. So we should aim at least for an incremental $1 trillion per year. If there are Sherpas here, please have your government learn what Excel is. A spreadsheet. And then how to do addition on the spreadsheet. And use real numbers, not, oh, why don't we do $20 billion now, something like this. Do some homework. I'm a professor, I assign homework to the finance ministers. Do some homework about what is really needed and how to get it. The sign says, time's up. That is true. Time's up for the finance ministers, not for me. I'm going to continue for a couple more minutes. The IMF and World Bank debt sustainability analysis is all wrong. I just want to point out. It sets low thresholds for borrowing arbitrarily. It is not based on any analytics that I taught my students who are working on this at the IMF. For that, you need a growth framework, not a 10-year arbitrary set of limits. The IMF says don't have debt over 30% of GDP. They should ask, would this incremental debt have a rate of return higher than the cost of borrowing? That's the basic question. They ask completely the wrong question. And the answer, when you analyze this carefully, is the debt should be much higher, but it should be for 40 years, commensurate with the scale, timing of development. So this is pretty basic stuff, and I would like the finance ministers to do the basics. The reason the IMF has a flawed debt sustainability analysis is that they fundamentally confuse two issues. One is liquidity or rollover risk, which is very real. If you are a developing country and you are trying to base your development on 7-year Euro bonds for a 40 or 50-year development program, good luck. You're going to get into a crisis at some point. That's rollover risk. The alternative is the long term. Is the borrowing meritorious in terms of the economic returns that it generates and the fiscal returns that will come with those economic returns? Let me make a basic proposition to you, very well documented. Economic development is a high return activity. an internal rate of return of 15 to 20%. That means if you make the investments of putting kids in school, building roads, making a power grid, getting digital access, and ask what is the economic return to that, it's vastly higher than the cost of capital. It's a good investment proposition. Again, clever use of an Excel spreadsheet can demonstrate this. I'd be happy if anyone would like to see the demonstrations. This is a good activity, but it takes 30 to 40 years to bring to fruition. So do not borrow short-term for a long-term program, because you will be run. There will be a crisis. Something will come up, and then you'll be in turmoil, and then your economy will die, and then after death, you will go to the IMF for the next round of, I won't go into Hindu concepts here, but after death, it is painful to be caught in this cycle. We need financial moksha. We need release from this cycle of short-term borrowing and short-term debt. So this is the basic point. We need long-term development finance. Loans should be more than 30 years. Countries should learn how to manage long-term debt. Liquidity crises can be avoided, especially by having long maturities. That's the number one way to do it. So what's the problem? The problem is we do not have, for half the world, access to funding at anything remotely like the scale that's needed. Because the level of development finance, if you add in all of the multilateral development banks, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Latin American Development Fund, the CAF, AIIB, the New Development Bank, add them all up, their loan flow is around $125 billion a year for $1 trillion program. So you go to the World Bank and you get a tiny bit. This is faking it, ladies and gentlemen. This isn't solving problems. This is going through the motions of solving problems. We need development finance at the scale that is needed. And then we need a long-term framework, both policy and analytical, to show how this works. And by the way, we don't need grants for this. This is just loans I'm talking about, because the loans pay off in economic development, but not immediately. If you put a 6-year-old in school and help that 6-year-old to stay in school through university, you have 30 years you're going to wait for the payout. Don't do that on a 7-year Eurobond. So existing finance fails badly. Half the world does not have an investment grade for credit. This, believe me, is the main point. Not a single low-income country has an investment grade credit rating, not one. And of the 53 lower middle income countries, only 3 have an investment grade. Only 3. So if you add up the 80 low-income and lower middle-income countries, only 3 of the 80 have an investment-grade credit rating. The rest are paying junk bond interest rates on short-term debts and going broke every few years through some rollover event. This is not development. This is cruelty. The spreads that countries are paying are out of sight. And I put in red here some of the G20 countries. Indonesia, Mexico, India, Brazil. Brazil's paying 12% on its 10-year bonds. African countries are paying 15% on their 10-year bonds. India pays 7 to 8%, Japan 1%, Germany 2%. This world gives finance to those who already have capital, and it deprives those who don't have capital of access to finance. And so when we hear about the market solutions, forget it. Please understand. I spoke to the largest money manager in the world recently. He said, don't count on us to be financing your friends. That's just a tip. What they will do is buy AAA bonds of the World Bank or the African Development Bank or the Asian Development Bank or the European Investment Bank. And those institutions which we created for development finance can do the job, but not if the scale is 1/10 of what is needed. And again, not to mention we're in another credit squeeze that's going to come, and we're going to see perhaps another large crisis, maybe not, but we're certainly not in any circumstance in which poorer countries are going to get market financing. So, thank you. Thank you for more money. So here's my recommendation. My recommendation is the following. We need at least a five-fold increase of the flow of funds through the multilateral development banks within the next 5 years. And we should be aiming by 2030 of a flow of at least $1 trillion a year. This is not even hard, ladies and gentlemen, to do. To understand what is needed for this is that the high-income countries put in paid-in capital that is leveraged roughly five-fold. The development banks keep their AAA rating. They can on-lend to their members on a AAA basis. That means 30-year plus maturities and interest rates which are 3% or 4% rather than 8% or 13% or none at all. And then with this vastly larger flow of financing, green development, the transformation of energy systems, SDG 4, children in school, the most fundamental of all investments, safe water and sanitation, SDG 6, access to digital services, and India is the world leader in using digital services for development, and what India has done with proper financing can cover the entire world in creating a magnificent basis for rapid and sustainable and inclusive growth in Africa is one of my first goals. Bring India's wisdom on this to the African context because it will be magnificent. All of this becomes possible with a modest increase of finance. Again, what is $1 trillion among friends? It's 1% of world income. It is 3% of world saving. On a leveraged basis, it could be mobilized by $100 to $200 billion per year from the rich world, which is being squandered in all sorts of terrible ways these days that could be used much better. I promise I won't go there, and I won't. But we are wasting money. We are destroying things, and for a tiny fraction of our income, we absolutely could achieve what we have set out to achieve and what we need to achieve for our survival and well-being. But please the daily life of half the world and of the finance ministers of half the world is, thank you for the good advice, but we have no ability to carry it out unless there is financing. That has been true for a long time. That has been my experience in 40 years of development finance work. But this is the first time that we have a world that is being led now by a broader and significant and developing part of the world. India, with its G20 presidency, can change the world, and I look forward to its doing so. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Jeff. I particularly enjoyed financial moksha. I think that's going to stay with me. The agenda for the panel discussion is to build on the keynote address that you heard from Professor Sachs. We will start by basically asking the first question to the panelists, which everyone, I want each of you to think about. One is, what should be G20's overarching development or green development agenda? That's number one. And number two, what are the big changes that you would like in the current setup to make that happen? But bear in mind, we're sitting in a country where a lot of our green, almost all our green transition is financed through domestic savings. That's number one. So this is, again, as a follow-up to Jeff's point. We have financed our green transition, but given the scale of the need, clearly there is a need to raise it internationally. We need that finance. That's number one. Number two, as you have seen in the last several years, the scale at which amenities are getting provided to all households in the country, particularly if you consider the bottom quintile, which is the bottom 20% of the population, the access to electricity is now almost universal. You look at piped drinking water, you are seeing a major expansion happen, toilets. You're seeing massive digitalization. All of this is being done. Of course, these are development objectives, but they're fundamentally linked to long-term economic growth and fundamental growth in human productivity. This is something I think America did in 1930s, 1940s, and they witnessed at least 2 decades of sustained growth on the back of that kind of tremendous development spending. Now, for emerging part of the market, global market, and particularly for India, we need that transition to happen. So what India has achieved at scale on many of these fronts, but the work still continues, and there is a gap. I would like each of you to think of, in terms of G20 particularly, what should the larger green agenda be, and what are the changes you'd like to see? Shloka, I'll start with you.
Thanks, Shamika. I think you've summarized it beautifully. And Professor Sachs, every time I hear you, I'm always, spellbound by your presentations. I wish I had a sort of similar analogy to, Hindu mythology. I don't, because I feel like if I talk about reincarnation, we're just coming back to the same world, and that's not really solving anything. But I think you did touch on a really important point around the principle of equity. You, of course, spoke about it from a more sort of global perspective. But I think even when we talk about India's continued development trajectory, and that's true for most developing countries, we really have to think about the fact that we don't exacerbate existing challenges for vulnerable populations. And so for me, that's a really important aspect to the vision and the agenda for the G20 as well. The fact that we do have to think, in India today, over 380 million people are exposed to heat-stressed or heat-induced labor. And that means that they contribute to nearly half of the country's GDP, yet they are excessively vulnerable to the impacts of climate action. And there is, again, a very sort of strong inequity in the fact that sectors and populations that contribute a tremendous amount to the GDP are some of the most vulnerable. And so as we think about that larger agenda or vision for the G20, it has to be bound in by the principles of resilience and equity. And so for me, there are 3 quick components here, and I'll try to stick to time. I think the first is, of course, the need to accelerate climate finance. I'm not going to harp on this. I think, Professor Sachs has spoken to this, so will the next panel. But I do want to say that right now, the majority of tracked climate finance in the world today is going towards mitigation, and that is also falling short of the need to ensure that global warming sticks to 2 degrees or 1.5. And of course, we're not even tracking adaptation finance. We know that it needs to significantly sort of be increased. We have no idea really where we are on that front. So that's a big, big gap, to your point, Shamika. I think the G20 is a critical, crucial platform for developing countries to speak to those gaps. And it's one that we have to sort of hammer out as hard as we possibly can. But I won't say more on accelerating climate finance. I think the second sort of component that's really important is increasing collaboration amongst diverse stakeholders. I don't think we're necessarily reaching across disciplines, building regional collaboration. We need solutions that are designed by experts across disciplines and sectors. That isn't necessarily happening right now, but there is opportunity to create new development paradigms. How are we promoting that agenda? How are we pushing that forward? We need government, business, civil society, and philanthropy to really sort of share knowledge, build resources, push forward technology transfers, and align on common agendas for a shared vision. That is not necessarily happening right now. I work in the philanthropic sector, so I'm a big proponent of how catalytic philanthropy and grant capital can be. I don't think that's playing a strong enough agenda here right now. The third was the need to promote subnational climate action. This is, I think, an absolute must. We must have the central government work with subnational and state actors to ensure that mitigation and adaptation goals are clearly aligned and that they are strategically moving forward together. So we know that the Paris Agreement has recognized non-state actors. They've clearly said that businesses, investors, civil society, etc., must also be recognized as key contributors in achieving climate or quantifiable emissions targets. But we know their contribution is growing, and yet commitments from these actors account for less than 10% of India's total emissions, at least as of 2016. And we know that corporates account for that larger share. And yet, as they are setting very ambitious net zero targets, we're not necessarily seeing that the emissions targets from industry or corporates are being incorporated into national goals. That's not happening as of yet. So you do need clear reporting on climate targets as well. So that's another area. If those three components can be incorporated into the larger vision, then, as I said, the principles of equity and, of course, resilience. You have over half of India's population that is going to urbanize. Where are we moving towards low carbon, infrastructure in our cities? They have to be, climate risk proof. They have to be built with those sort of low carbon development pathways in mind. There's a very, very important role around sort of ensuring that this conversation is inclusive in that way, and that we recognize that we're living in a world today where there is no critical pathway to sustainable development that is innocent of climate anymore. So as Professor Sachs pointed out in his sort of the intersection between every single SDG and climate and the climate challenge is one that we just have to bring into our lexicon. But I will pause here, Shamika, and hand it to you.
Thank you, Shilka. An important point to highlight is given the philanthropy sector and the potential to put together that kind of finance, remember you're sitting in perhaps the only country in the world which has a mandatory CSR law. So there is that kind of a bandwidth to also tweak it and make it more targeted towards the bigger gaps. The second point is, of course, in terms of the larger CSR, the reporting, and again, the issue of reporting and fine-tuning the lexicon and exactly having a measure of the outcome other than just spending of the money will also be useful for the larger green development objective that we have. I'll come to you, Anirudh.
First of all, thank you very much for organizing this. I just want to build quickly on Jeff's point. Jeff made a central point that economic development is good investment. And it is absolutely true. Not only that, connecting to the topic of today's discussion, we believe, and we actually do know how to use Excel. So we have used it often. And not only economic development is good investment, the only path to development right now is green development. I just want to underline that. That is the only path. There is no other 16 different paths. to do. So we actually did what Jeff just asked us. We actually said, okay, if you were to green development, if you did all the things you're supposed to do, what will happen to the global economy? Or what we came out is, just from now till 2030, there's a $4.3 trillion gain to the global economy if you did all the green things that you need. 26 million new jobs added, additional jobs that would be added. So this is a positive path for growth. Positive path. If you didn't do it, what is the counterfactual? IPCC report is the counterfactual. IPCC report just came out, I think last week, no, week before last. That said 1.1 degree, which is today, we are living today in a 1.1 degree world, that the loss that we are seeing, just physical loss, not emotional loss, just physical loss is in billions of dollars. They calculate by 2030, it'll be $500 billion. That is 3 times the number Jeff said of total bilateral, multilateral aid that goes in. So that we will be actually losing more than we would actually be able to push through from our systems. Pakistan flood was 30. One incident was a $30 billion incident. The GDP reduced from 5% to 2% with one incident. So this is the fact. This is what Excel would do for you. But what does it actually mean if you did these things? And I just want to pick up what Amitabh was saying. We all talk about energy. Energy is a very important part of the transition. I want to underline, it is not the only part of the transition. Energy is very important. Energy transition to green energy is very important. So is getting green energy to 700 million people who don't have energy access today. That is as important if you wanted a politically viable strategy to do these things in the front. So is agriculture reform. Agriculture, food production, all the things that we eat, all of us, actually is the major cause of natural system destruction today. Actually, single most largest cause of natural system is because of food and fiber procurement. So that needs to be not only connected to change for protecting the earth, but also to make sure millions of 50% of India's employment is directly connected to land, 65% in Africa. If these employments don't change, we actually will not have the development outcome Jeff was talking about. Finally, cities. So thank you very much. We raised cities. Most people in the world live in cities. Most poor people in the world will soon live in cities. If cities produce 70% of emission today, if cities don't change, transportation, building, waste, if these things don't change, there is no path to, but cities also are center of innovation and productivity. As if these things don't work together to actually bring a more productive, more innovative place. But one thing we haven't talked about, which is I see the sign life here, that how much demand side change can bring to this journey. We've all talked about supplying more energy, more car or electrified vehicle. IPCC, this is not us, IPCC calculates 60-65% change can come from demand side shifts. This doesn't mean just reducing consumption, I just want to repeat. There's reducing consumption, it is true for 10% of the population of the world that produces 50% of emission. That's not true for the rest. It's actually doing things differently at the same time raising quality of life indicator. So this is what the package looks like. And I think there's enough science there today to show the detail each one of them. And I must point out, very few of this thing, except carbon capture maybe, that requires massive new innovation of technology. Some do. But there are a lot of things we actually know how to do that does require massive innovation and finance. I want to underline what Jeff was saying for us to get there.
Thank you, Anirudh. On that, 2 basic points. You know, the whole millet mission that India has embarked on. Of course, food security is one concern, and nutritional security for us is another concern. But one that we don't talk about enough is ecological security, because millet has far more water efficient, the efficiency is far higher than the other cereals like rice and wheat. In fact, 6 times as much as rice, etc. So there is an attempt to change larger taste patterns as well. Particularly, again, remember we are $2,200 per capita per year, so we might be one of the poorest countries within the G20, but we know that the long-term sustainable change will require these things simultaneously. The second point is, and this is a recent paper that came out in the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, using alternate measures of urbanization, not our census of 12 years back, India might be anywhere between 60 and 65% urban today. So a lot of these conversations we are thinking of, we think 50% because we are thinking 12 years back. The real economy in India is moving much faster than we might actually be aware of. I'll come to you now, Bogolo.
Thank you very much. It's usually very difficult to respond after so many people have said some points that you would have wished to echo, so I don't know about you, Ovais. I'm about to take all your points. I think that first, we shouldn't get too bogged down on issues around mitigation, which is where we tend to focus our energies on when we are thinking about green development. And we should have much more concerted efforts on adaptation and resilience. And in having that concerted thoughtfulness around adaptation and resilience, we think about the climate resilient pathways and development models and trajectories that combine both adaptation, mitigation, but have a really strong focus on resilience because we see the increased vulnerabilities to climate shock. And so when we do that, it brings us to the point that Jeff was mentioning of that development makes sense. And when we do that, all of these development pathways will really bring us back to attaining the Sustainable Development Goals. And so I think that we have to really position within the G20 agenda strongly on adaptation and make sure that we are having policy responses that anticipate and cope with the impacts that we cannot avoid. The impacts that can be responded to in a timeliest manner. I mean, we saw the SG earlier this year trying to have a conference of response for Bangladesh. And you can't have a haphazard response when we know that the vulnerabilities are increasing. So we have to have a very clear agenda on how is it exactly that we're going to respond to these shocks that we know are coming, and that should be part of the policy structuring and mechanisms for the G20 and beyond. And we have to be very clear about advancing, for example, the ideas behind the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda from COP27, but also think about the various resilient pathways. So we need nature to attain our long-term climate goals. But we always talk about the decarbonization agenda, even within the global stocktake. So how are we actually going to pay and incentivize the protection of nature that is such a crucial part of a green development pathway when we do not necessarily ever come to an agreement on the commercial value of nature? So I think that is something else that the G20 should certainly be thinking about. The innovative financial instruments that can unlock the value of nature, it be the climate debt swaps or how we can be more efficient within the carbon market space. And finally, also think, I know there will be a finance panel, but also think about the climate contingency clauses within MDB loans, which allow for debt repayments to be frozen during an event of a climate shock or when there are issues, and how we also relate to non-state actors in the financial space. We should crowd in more private sector financing. And these are some of the objectives that have been set out by the COP27 group on sustainable debt. It's a debt coalition for COP27, and I would also encourage that we look at some of those outcomes and recommendations that have been highlighted out of there. And then lastly, a very critical point is accountability. We all make all kinds of pledges, and there will be pledges made out of the G20 process. But who do we hold accountable, and how do we hold people accountable? And I think this is a very crucial part. The SG was talking about, the UN SG was talking about accountability last year, and it's going to be a big agenda going into COP28. Can we have the same, if not more, concerted efforts on accountability within the G20? And including for non-state actors. There are things like the race to zero that can hold private sector accountable on their decarbonization agenda, on their relationship with nature, and their relationship with people. So in closing is just to think about green development within the confines of a climate-resistant and more durable economic development model. Thank you.
Thank you, Bogolo. You know, we have an institution called Social Stock Exchange in India. It was formed just 2 years back. And the core objective of that is to be able to raise finance and do a matching. It's not a regular exchange where instruments are exchanged, but this is where finance can be raised for these kind of social objectives. While such institutions are getting established to be able to raise finance, simultaneously what we are also witnessing is a bottom-up approach towards allowing for certain instruments to come up for green development. The state of Madhya Pradesh, which is one of our poorest states, is in fact doing a measure for every district of the state. It's doing a measure of the green cover. There is also a measure of biodiversity. To be able to then create indexed instruments, to be able to then raise finances to maintain this kind of valuable green cover. I know that Meghalaya is doing something very similar. This is the state in the northeast. So while institutions are getting established to be able to do that, you're also seeing states take proactive decision to be able to raise and grow something highly localized, but precise measures of what we value to make financing possible. Ovais, I come to you as the last speaker on this issue. And if you'd like, you could be the first speaker on the next question, so please.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And first of all, thank you to the Government of India, Amitabh Kant, and all G20 organizers for inviting UNFCCC. And it's a pleasure for me to be here. And I've listened to all the interventions with great attention. And thank you very much, Jeffrey, to again hear you speak so clearly about the economic model that we are living through and what needs to change. But from my side, what I'd like to, first of all, a short introduction. I'm from UNFCCC. We do these COPs. You must have heard about the COPs. We've done 27 of those, and this year will be 28. And a lot has been said. What I personally believe, we are already at 1.1 degree global warming. And what that means, numbers are one thing, economic factors are one thing, but if we look at it from a people-centered approach, every fraction of a degree results in loss of life and livelihood. That is absolutely clear. So we need to have that perspective in any kind of paradigm shift, to have that people-centered approach. Very, very, very important. And again, since we focused on COP28 this year, what I'd like to see from G20 is clear and unequivocal messages about the net zero by 2050 for all the developing countries and 2040 for the developed world. This is very, very clear. We need to get there. And we have the agreements, we have the tools, we have the science telling us what needs to be done, and what is needed is the political will, and the big elephant in the room that we have already talked about is the finance, to unlock the finance. And that is extremely important, and we'll hear more about it in the next session. And to move away, in doing so, we need to move away also from extractive to regenerative ways of doing business and living in all sectors of the economy. So that is extremely relevant to this discussion. We need to do that. And lastly, what I also believe and I see is this decade is decade of action, and we have huge opportunities if we do the right thing, because this year is also time for course correction. We already heard from IPCC. There is the GST that is going to happen, and that will clearly show us where we are heading towards not a good trajectory. So there is a need for course correction. And that course correction is through the essential tools in the UNFCCC process are the NDCs and national adaptation plans. So we need to utilize that. So in the end, what I can say is that we have, as I said, everything that is very, very clear what needs to be done. It is that political will and finance flows. That is what's needed.
Thank you, Vice. I'll come to the second question, and Jeff, I'd like to start with you. You educated us, you highlighted on the core things that are broken. In fact, fundamentally, the World Bank was set up with the core objective of financing development and taking on long-term risks, because the markets are likely to respond only when large, either multilateral or sovereign investments make an entry. Then you crowd in private investment from the market. So there is a role that we had decided upon several decades back, but that role is not getting performed right now. Now, given that we are in a situation like this, how can the international community be proactive in responding to the current and the future challenges and fostering the acceleration of progress on SDGs? What exactly needs to be done?
We have a serious political economy problem and a serious problem of bad arithmetic. The bad arithmetic I already talked about, which is generally a rather slovenly approach by almost all institutions, national and international, in not following through on the logic of objectives that are set. So part of this is homework. You set sustainable development goals. It behooves you to say, how are they going to be met? Not just they're important, we love them, we have a box here, we have a box here, but actually to do the homework of how they can be achieved. Generally speaking, most of the goals that we set are long-term investment programs. If you want kids in school, you do education sector planning, teachers, schools, curriculum, and so forth. Rather straightforward. If you want a health system, SDG 3, these are known things. People go to schools to be able to design these things. We do not have a serious effort or capacity intrinsically in international institutions or even in our governments to take goals and turn them into plans. So this is, again, the homework assignment. WRI can do that. It can help advise any government how to do this. We need those. And for UNFCCC, I would like to see more emphasis on the low emission development strategies, Article 4.19, which says, don't tell us about the next 8 or 10 years, tell us about 2050. What is your plan? 2050, oh my God, we haven't even thought about that. Make them think about that, because this is a long-term process. And of course, it's not even long-term to 2050 anymore. Then comes the money. What's the problem with the money? The problem is the rich countries don't care, okay? They don't care. There's no one in the US Congress that says, oh my God, people are poor abroad. Nobody. Believe me, 40 years, I figured it out. They don't even try to care anymore. But they are part of this international family, the one family. They have to be held to caring. It doesn't come naturally. But that's why we have the G20, not the G7. The G7 is 7 rich countries getting together to not care. The G20 is the whole world getting together, having to care. That's why we have the G20. What's important about the G20 now is that India is a world leader. China is a world leader. Brazil is a world leader. These are not just, oh, isn't it quaint that they're sitting alongside country X? No, this is our world. So this is why the G20 has to say, ladies and gentlemen, let's get out the spreadsheet. There's no other meeting. This is the meeting. So this is really difficult to emphasize. If the US has its way, oh, it's inconvenient. We don't want to ask Congress. They don't like this stuff. They don't even know where all these places are on the map. And we've got an election coming up, and so why don't we say we care? Okay, that will not get the world safe. But 20 countries that represent almost 90% of world output. And I keep saying, please invite Africa as the G21 and bring in 1.4 billion people, another $3 trillion of GDP, and the voices of a crucial part of the world that will be the most populous part of the world in the 21st century. Bring them to the table. Then we have a perfect discussion, and everybody has to have responsibility. And then, honestly, I know, I'll just make a very personal remark. 50 years ago, I took introductory macroeconomics. 50 years ago, okay? This spring, I walked into a classroom and there was this wonderful young assistant professor, fresh from Yale. Her name is Janet Yellen, okay? She taught me macroeconomics. We've been friends for precisely half a century. She knows how to do growth models. She gets all of this. She said we need to go from billions to trillions in an important speech last year. Let's take the G20 process seriously. It is the discussion in the whole world to get this right.
That's an excellent point, and also a sense of urgency. Shloka, the role that the G20, or in this case, of course, by extending the larger multilateral system and perhaps governance, big reforms within the multilateral system to be able to do what they were set up to do. In terms of philanthropy, because that's a sector you're coming from, what role do you see philanthropy in terms of plugging this gap?
I truly believe in the catalytic, power of philanthropy. I think what people don't realize is that the renewable energy market in India was built off of the back of philanthropies that funded organizations like TERI to build out research studies and pilots, and they proved the viability of that opportunity, on top of which markets arrived and then policies were built. And today India has the most vibrant renewable energy market in the world. Do you know how many sectors we still have to build similar to the renewable energy market? So there is absolutely critical sort of need and a role for grant capital that is unrestricted, flexible, patient, does not expect an ROI, and can truly build towards societal needs and aspirations. I also think philanthropic capital is incredibly reflective of the global South's ambitions. Firstly, I hate this global North, global South like binary. I think we have too many binaries in the climate ecosystem. Another one is climate versus development, mitigation versus adaptation. We really have to start redefining how we think about the role this capital plays and sort of the solutions that we're building across the globe. So to give you an example, I think the G20 is, Professor Sachs alluded to this, and I think he put it beautifully. This is really the forum to define that leadership agenda for the developing world. We need an equitable, inclusive agenda around climate action, one that doesn't place this binary between climate and development. And, quite frankly, we have somehow convinced folks that climate action or solutions on climate mean that we have to move towards a world of greater austerity, that somehow we need to think about a world with less conveniences, less stuff. And actually what we're failing to recognize is that our notion of wealth is purely defined by goods and services today. There is decreasing mental and physical wellness. There is a disconnect from ourselves, from each other, from the natural environment. We are living in an austere world today. I'd rather that we redefine the climate agenda as one in which we can work towards abundance. And what does abundance mean for us? That's really the role that capital like philanthropy can play. That's the role of the G20 in a platform like this. That's the conversation the developing world has to bring to the larger global narrative around equity and inclusion. What does it mean when we say we put people first? I don't think we're speaking that language in a broader sort of inclusive way ourselves. I always laugh. I say folks in the climate sector are like finance and doctors, because we've built our own lexicon and it's completely exclusionary. We're not actually bringing in people into the conversation. A forum like G20 should have private sector here on the table, just as much as we have sort of representatives from multilateral institutions. We should have greater civil society representation here. This has to be an interdisciplinary conversation, one that isn't really restricted to sort of just governments and multilateral institutions. I've been all over the place, but I hope you sort of get the response on that front.
We get it, Shloka. Thank you. Anirudh, I think the most powerful point that you made in your opening intervention was the counterfactual that a study, through the studies at WRI. So in some sense, could there be an attempt to do this cost of inaction, a kind of a frightful study? Perhaps that is what is required in terms of the larger point Jeff is making in terms of the urgency of getting people on the table too. So could we do something on cost of inaction at WRI?
Yeah, I think the IPCC report is the counterfactual. You couldn't have a more scientifically robust report of what will happen, and how as one said, every degree matters. Every degree higher is a story of death and destruction. But I also think the other part of the story, I just want to underline what Jeff just said. I don't think there is any model out there that in the finance part where there is not a serious transfer of resources from rich country to poorer country for this to work. How that happens, whether it happens directly to the World Bank, it's irrelevant. That transfer has to take place. And I also want to underline this point, I think, Jeff, you were making. It is absolutely fundamental that sorry to use Global South, but emerging economy, that's the other thing that I use these days, but I'm using Global South for a minute, that India is leading this, and Indonesia led this last year, and Brazil's going to lead this next year, that these innovation and solution of the new story will come from Global South. And it is so much more powerful, and I can't underline that enough, that this change has to happen. But I do think the story that needs to be underlined, that it's not just one thing needs to happen. It's a story of economic transition where 3 outcomes happen. Not only we have a decarbonized world, that is very important. I think everyone gets it. But we need a world that is actually, we are not extracted to nature. We coexist with nature, because science of nature and climate and people is exponentially better than it was even when Paris was written. That we cannot, I was in the water conference last week. The whole point there was to think about how water needs to be thought of as a system rather than silos. That it needs to be a system, how that impacts everything we're doing, human activity, of course, but many other things. But the bigger point is that this transitions are hard, this will be hard too. The outcome is actually very positive. And I don't think we talk about positiveness of the outcome. We talk about the sacrifices that is needed. It's all a story of sacrifice. But I don't think it's a story of sacrifice. It is very much a positive. This transition, we need to figure out how to do the transition. People use the word just transition, the transition. But what India's presidency has emphasized, whatever the transition is, it has to be good for everyone. Otherwise, this is a political transition as well. It will not happen. And look what's happening in Europe right now. Germany just had a fight with the EU on internal combustion engine. I hope that got resolved. But what I'm saying is these are the kind of things that will happen in the transition that we need to learn from. The last thing I want to take Jeff's point about finance. Jeff, I agree with you. I think the multilateral development banks absolutely have to change. And I think Amar and others are going to talk about next panel. But we don't see a path out of here that doesn't include a massive amount of private capital flowing into these issues, together with philanthropic capital and public capital. So I think, Shloka, you talked about, we need a amazing new kind of partnerships that builds these things together, that actually builds system change that is required across. and not single solution. And Jeff's point, a long-term vision of what needs to be changed.
You know, I was just reflecting on the word transition and remembering some words from a lady in KwaZulu-Natal, actually, who said, you keep talking about transition to something as if we already had something. And so transition, the way it's couched, prepurposes that we were somewhere and now we need to change the way we are consuming or the way we are producing, while some of us are merely just trying to have. And which is why it's important that in these conversations of climate and development, we speak to a green development pathway that is inclusive to those that are in a position of have not. Because otherwise, if we focus on the transition, we are once again increasing inequalities that a global and multilateral system has actually increased. And so my thinking just around the G20 now and India's presidency is working on mechanisms of reducing the inequalities of power, the inequalities of access, and inequalities of participation. And so in that model, then we start to consider how is it that we provide the same kind of development and privilege for us to think in this particular instance, we would rather transition into something. But if we start off in those areas that currently do not have with a green development pathway, we are already driving in a sustainable and climate resilient model. So that is the kind of space that I'd also like for the G20 to consider. Not all of us at this moment have dealt with issues of sanitation, and not all of us have dealt with issues of access to water. But we do certainly hope that by 2030, there would have been progress in those spaces. And then it just all takes us back to issues of finance that we're going to talk about, that is going to be talked about later. But we cannot really get enough of speaking to the importance of the flow of finance to enable the green development pathway. Because we will not, talking about decommissioning a coal plant without extremely increasing access to green finance for the development of renewable energy will not produce a sustainable development that is people-centered as we wish to deal with. If we don't deal with inequalities, then we will be back here talking about how people are not taking care of nature and how people are not helping us meet the long-term climate goals. How can they when they have nothing to eat?
Excellent. Ovais, any thoughts on the existing big gaps?
Yep, thank you. 2 points. One is, Shok already mentioned about multilateralism, that multilateralism, as we know and we've gotten accustomed to, is multilateralism between governments. But where we need to go, and I see that in the COP process, is now it's becoming more inclusive multilateralism, where you have civil society, private sector, and more, very importantly, the youth. And that's where I'm seeing also many governments and many parties who are including those in their formal delegations, and they're sitting in the rooms and influencing the decision. And I would like to see more of that, and that's something that G20 could take that more seriously. And second point is about behavior. Article 12, I believe, of the Paris Agreement is extremely clear. We talked about education, but we also need to incorporate and internalize and integrate climate education right from the beginning, because the behavioral change, the societal change that we need to bring about is only going to happen through a longer term education right from the beginning.
Thank you. So that brings us to the end of the comments from the speakers. We have 2 minutes. We'll take a few questions from the floor.
Hi, Harsh Vijay Singh from World Economic Forum. Thank you for the very interesting panel. A number of points were mentioned, mainly around accelerating SDG progress. One thing I wanted to highlight was the element of transparency, especially given that the collective action nature of SDGs relies on international collaboration, for which trust is essential. And we have so many parties intervening and trying to help each other out. Transparency on the progress of SDG is essential. So as of 2021, we had less than half of the countries with robust, comparable, timely information on 8 out of 17 SDGs. So as we are talking about enablers, finance, governance, etc., what are your thoughts on transparency or increased transparency as an enabler of sustainable development?
Thank you, Harsh. Thank you. I speak from the World Health Organization, WHO. My name is Stéphanie Sédou. I am the Sherpa. Thank you very much for a very inspiring panel. I was simply drawing attention to some reflections and work that's going on the health metrics, or in other words, the health benefits to financial investment in general. I think this should definitely be linked as much as possible. Professor Sachs mentioned it in his introductory remarks. I've not really heard that much about health later on in the panel, to really, and that goes to the previous point, ensure that the benefits of any investment in climate, or in other words, green development, is intrinsically linked to benefits to achieving all the other SDGs. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So who would like to respond?
I can go
Yes,
first.
Anil, please.
Just on Harsh's point on, I would just address your point on transparency. I can't emphasize enough the importance of it to make change happen. We very, very strongly believe in it. I just want to share one example. We at WRI, about 10 years back, we started publishing Health of World Forests, geospatial data, year over year, where it's going, what's fire. And now, independently, people have shown 20% of forest deforestation directly connected just to the transparency method. So transparency couldn't be, we call it radical transparency, more transparent you can be. We publish, with cooperation with UNFCCC, how people are doing on NDCs, the voluntary thing, that matters every year. We actually use that. So I think we need to do much more. I'm right now very concerned about just transition. That's something I want to work on, but how this money is flowing. So I want to emphasize and highlight your point. I very much agree with your point on health. I'm sorry we didn't emphasize it. Any step you take, anything you do on transportation, for example, is directly connected to air quality and health outcomes in this. So that point I made about a better outcome, the better outcome actually includes huge amount of positive health outcomes for a population across through many kinds of climate-related interventions. So thank you for bringing that up.
Floka?
I wanted to make a couple quick points. First, on health, of course I agree on the health benefits, but I'd also like WHO to produce cost estimates of achieving SDG 3.8, universal health coverage. I led a commission for WHO 23 years ago called Investing in Health for Economic Development. We costed the basic health system 23 years ago. We need that costing from WHO now so that we can say that's part of the financing needs. And I would really encourage WHO to do that. I wanted to say a word quickly about the private sector. Of course, we need private finance for a lot, and private finance can do a lot just as private finance. And I think a great deal of the telecoms and digital investments are a demonstration of that. There are many things that private capital cannot do. It will not put children in school. It will not make universal health coverage. It will not do many basic infrastructure needs. Some yes, many no. It all depends. It will not do climate adaptation. for which there is a great societal return, but not necessarily a monetized return. So there are many issues. But my heart sank 10 years ago at the start of the SDG period when many private sector financial leaders were brought to the UN because eyes were dazzled by the trillions. And I knew that the money would not flow from their accounts to the things that were important. It was a distraction. Maybe you needed some economics to understand that because it's easy to be dazzled by somebody who has $10 trillion under management. Without a public framework, without public policy, without public finance, the private finance will not come for crucial areas. So I just want to emphasize that because there's no private-led solution that doesn't include what we've been talking about. Of course it plays a role. Countries should mobilize their own domestic finance, provident funds, saving funds, pension funds. These are wonderful core institutions. They can finance a lot in a country. They can finance green buildings. They can finance many things. So develop the domestic capital markets. Of course, international capital from pension funds and other long-term fund sources will play a role, but they don't know development, they don't know these countries, they don't even know infrastructure especially. So there needs to be a framework to bring that in. And that's why I emphasize the simplest way to engage the private sector is to sell a World Bank AAA bond. Then you've engaged the private sector saving in development finance. It's not the only way, but it is a very good way to do it. But I'm happy to work on bringing the private finance in. It's going to play a huge role, but we should not fail at the G20 to mobilize the public financing now, because that's what the G20 leaders can do now.
Thank you. I think we've run out of time now. Thank you, speakers. And also, very briefly, but we need to acknowledge the Observer Research Foundation and United Nations India for getting a perfectly balanced gender panel. Congratulations. Well done. Thank you, speakers.